From the National Catholic Register, this is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
The Church is now officially in the state of sede vacante, the interregnum, marked by the passing of Pope Francis this last week. This week on Register Radio, we talk with Frank Rocca, Senior Vatican Analyst for EWTN News. Hello, I'm Matthew Bunson. Thank you so much for joining me here on Register Radio in what is an unusual and important episode of Register Radio. Well, Frank, let's dive right into this conversation. Let's start with the news that shook all of us on Monday. What were you doing and what was your initial reaction to the passing of the Holy Father?
Well, I was actually in northern Italy with a family, my wife's family, and I was coming back later that day, so it was very short. I thought I was safe to be gone for 48 hours, but not quite. On Monday morning, the first message we got as journalists on Telegram, the Telegram app, was very mysterious and shocking or unsettling, I should say. It said there will be a video transmission shortly coming from the chapel of Santa Marta. Santa Marta is the Vatican guest house where the Pope lives. And so it didn't say what the video presentation would be about, but one knew that it was just such an odd announcement coming at an odd time, a little bit around between 9 and 10 in the morning. And so I thought, frankly, the first thought that crossed my mind briefly was he's going to resign and he's going to announce it from the chapel. Because remember that Benedict, when he resigned, it was in a consistory of cardinals for canonizations, and he chose that setting. And I thought, if he's going to resign, he probably wouldn't just send a tweet. He probably would want to do it in some kind of ceremonial way. But then 3 minutes later came it was a very strange thing, because I guess they didn't have the live transmission. They released a video, but they released the text of Cardinal Farrell's comments. Cardinal Farrell is a U.S. cardinal, former Bishop of Dallas, who's the Camerlengo, or the person who basically oversees the Vatican during the sede vacante, and he told the news that the Pope had died a couple hours before. So that was, and I tweeted, "The Pope is dead," which was a bit blunt, but it was.
It accomplished the mission.
Yeah, and then I tried to see if I could get back more quickly, but I really couldn't. So I came back in that afternoon and came over here. We're very close to St. Peter's Square as we're speaking, and there were already many people. Now, part of that was the day after Easter. Easter Monday is a national holiday in Italy, as it is in many Catholic countries, and it was also very fine weather. So it was an odd mix of people. There were people who were coming down to pray or just pay their respects. So that was Monday, and on Tuesday the General Congregations met for the first time. That is, the cardinals met to plan the funeral, plan everything. The cardinals who were in Rome, there were 60-some, so a fraction of all the ones who are eligible to attend the General Congregations, who are over 200. But they met and they decided that the next day the Pope's body would be transferred to St. Peter's, where it would lie in state and people would be able to come and visit. And then they've been meeting this week, and the numbers have steadily risen as the cardinals come into Rome. And of course, the electors are the ones under 80 who can actually vote, and that number of actual electors is still uncertain. Of who will actually vote is still uncertain, as you know, Matthew, because yes. A couple have said already that they're too sick to come. Cardinal Becciu, the Italian cardinal who was convicted of financial crimes, was not supposed to be an elector supposedly, but now he's been apparently contesting that. So
I want to come back to Cardinal Becciu in a minute. But in terms of the general congregations, I mean, this is all very standard, and the numbers of participants have only grown.
Yeah.
What are some of the initial, we've talked about the translation of the Pope's body, and then setting the date for the funeral, but what are some of the other practical aspects that the general congregations oversee? Because obviously the authority or power of the College of Cardinals and the Camerlengo are very circumscribed.
That's right. They can't make any major decisions that are certainly not about church teaching or I guess a church law, but they do have to take certain decisions. They have to decide, as I said, when the body would be taken over to St. Peter's, when the coffin would be sealed, which was they decided would be Friday night, when the funeral would be held, and they will eventually decide when the conclave begins. They are, as you say, limited by law. It's supposed to be between 15 and 20 days after the Pope dies, but they have some leeway there. So there's already some, I understand, some discussion about that. Some people would like to have as long a period as possible before. And some of those people, I understand, also want to have a relatively long conclave. Conclaves in recent history have been a couple of days typically, but some of them think that this is a momentous thing, and well, it always is, but that this is a key moment, and as much deliberation as possible is necessary.
So you've covered a number of pontificates, I know, and a number of conclaves. This is what, your second or third?
Well, I was in Rome when John Paul died, and I was around, but I really wasn't covering the Vatican. So really, it's only my second conclave in any kind of concentrated way.
Yeah. Obviously, the slightly different atmosphere from 2013, that the conclave that elected Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Pope Francis, because that, as you said, was started with the resignation of Pope Benedict, so rather than his death in 2013. But what's the atmosphere been like compared to 2013 that you're seeing?
Well, in 2013, the Pope on February 11th said, I shocked everybody and said I'm going to step down at the end of the month, on February 28th. So he gave almost 3 weeks, or is it 3? Yeah, no, not quite 3 weeks, but he gave the rest of the month for time for everybody to get to Rome. There was still a Pope in that period, so it wasn't sede vacante. In fact, he took some measures in that period, and then. And there wasn't that atmosphere of mourning, so it was there was a kind of tension because you still had the Pope there, and then people were curious and wondering what was going to be the new arrangement. How was the Pope Emeritus? We didn't even know that he would be called the Pope Emeritus until Benedict told
right.
us. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of attention paid, especially initially, to what's going to be this new setup. Having a living retired Pope, which hadn't been the case for 600 years. And then, of course, everyone arrived, and then they were able to, once there was a sede vacante, they had the conclave very quickly. I mean, relatively quickly. The conclave was on the 12th, right, or the 11th, right? He was elected on the 13th, so I think it was the 11th that actually began, the 11th of March. So very, very quickly, because they'd had time. They'd had weeks to arrive and get in Rome, get settled, have informal conversations.
Essentially 5 ballots. To finish the job.
Yeah, because the first day there's only one, if I recall correctly. Right. Yeah. So but I did have an observation about 2005. You mentioned, or I mentioned John Paul's, which is and it's been noted already, the turnout of mourners for we haven't had a papal funeral for 20 years. Mm-hmm. We did have the funeral for Benedict, but he was no longer a reigning pope. But we haven't had a papacy end in death, let's say, for 20 years. And it was almost exactly 20 years ago. It was at this time of year, the numbers, many remember the enormous turnout of mourners for John Paul. There were, according to the Italian government statistics that were released by the Vatican, 3 million people came to Rome to pay their respects. More than 1.5 million passed through St. Peter's Basilica over 3 days. In the first day, 500,000 passed through. The line was over 3 miles long. The average waiting time was 13 hours. So that was a benchmark. That was a record, probably. And it's no criticism, or it's not to diminish the mourning for Francis to say that this
or even making a comparison.
Yeah. To say this is a fraction of that. It's about a tenth. The first day of about 50,000 people walked through the Basilica, and it's interesting to ask oneself why that is. I have some thoughts, but you probably do as well. But I think one factor was that John Paul was a great hero of the Polish people, and Poland is a bus ride away. And many Poles came then later to his beatification, to his canonization. So I think that must have been a big factor. But I think there were other factors too. I think we live in an age that is more fragmented. Our culture is more fragmented. Our media is more fragmented. And I think it's just hard for anyone to be the kind of towering, dominant figure that John Paul was. I don't think there's anyone comparable now. And also, I think related to that, John Paul was a symbol of the victory in the Cold War. For even people who weren't Catholic, he was seen as embodying that struggle, which was victorious in a kind of definitive way with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism. And Francis is associated with many causes that are right now on the back foot around the world, including in his native Argentina. As right-wing populism grows, Francis's causes, social and political causes like advocacy for migrants or for the environment, care of the environment, are not as popular. And so I think that might be a factor as well.
Yeah, could we also say that the role of social media, in which our news tends now to be very virtual, it's digested in very different ways. So participation in a lot of real world events, so to speak, you can see that diminished in almost every aspect of culture. Would you say that that's an aspect of this too?
I think that's a great point. I think in 2005 there were no smartphones. I think they existed, some prototypical smartphones, but not really. The iPhone had not been. There was a BlackBerry, but most people didn't have anything like that. We were not as enraptured by the online world as we are now. I think that's true. And then COVID too. I think probably remember that was 5 years ago. We were all locked down. And of course we've come out of that, but I think maybe that also put a damper on things. So it's not as much of this public, communal, physical contact that we used to have traditionally.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Register Radio here on EWTN News. My guest is Frank Rocca, Senior Vatican Analyst for EWTN News. Again, please stay with us. There's a lot more to discuss.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
And welcome back to Register Radio. I'm your host, Matthew Bunson, Vice President, Editorial Director for EWTN News. Thank you so much for joining me on this very significant week and series of weeks in the life of the Church following the passing of our Holy Father, Pope Francis, and the impending election of his successor by a conclave. My guest this week is Frank Rocca, Senior Vatican Analyst for EWTN News. Frank, again, thank you so much for joining me. I know that both of us have been very busy this last week, but I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us.
No, it's great to be with you, Matthew. In fact, in person here in Rome, just a few meters away from St. Peter's Square.
So we were talking about Pope Francis, and I think it's worthwhile taking a little bit of time, especially on this weekend, where his funeral is going to be marked. He will be transferred to Santa Maria Maggiore as his final resting place. But let's talk about his legacy. What do you see are some of the most important aspects of the legacy of Pope Francis?
Well, I think it's clear that Catholic social teaching has been around for a while. He didn't invent it, but he certainly put a strong emphasis on, the care for the poor, concern for social justice, economic justice, care for the environment. That was a very, very evident in his pontificate, and certainly the part of the message, a great part of the message of his that resonated beyond the church itself. I mean, most people, many people know that he was the champion of the poor, champion of migrants, associated with the environment because of Laudato Si, his 2015 encyclical, which talked about climate change and global warming and so forth. So I think that will go down as part of his legacy. Certainly he'll be known as one of the social popes, if that's the correct way of saying it, I think. he's kind of a milestone in that he was the first from the global south, the first from the Americas, first from Latin America. So in that sense, he reflects, 100 years from now, when people read histories of the papacy and the church, they'll say, oh, that's right, that marked the demographic shift in the world, in the church. I think his legacy in terms of the teaching and in the terms of the life of the church, this is a famous journalistic cop-out, but time will tell. I mean, it depends on what the cardinals do when there's this election. Did they choose someone who, follows in his way, or someone who maybe takes another path, maybe chooses to go back a little bit? Back is a loaded term, because any future pope who, if the next pope, for example, chooses to clarify or reaffirm traditional teaching, then that will be portrayed in many quarters as a step back, as a kind of retrograde movement, restoration, whatever you will. So it's a delicate question. But if, in fact, the next pope continues very strongly with this idea of synodality, generally letting more voices come into the governance of the church and even into the development of doctrine, if they continue with that, and that encourages liberalizing trends, then Francis will have been seen as a pivotal figure.
As we again look back on this pontificate, coming from Latin America, certainly you can see the impact of the Latin American perspective in Evangelii Gaudium, his apostolic exhortation that some have said is a blueprint for his pontificate. But is it worthwhile looking also at something like the Aparecida document that he helped draft in 2007 that was supposed to itself be a blueprint for evangelization in Latin America, but he seems to have brought that whole concept of evangelization with him to the pontificate. Would that be a fair?
Yes, I think so. He also brought, and this is perhaps less well known, but he was an exponent of something called the theology of the people, which is inspired to some extent by the movement of Peronism in his native Argentina. It's a little murky and hard to to explain, but I think that it had less emphasis on class conflict. And it wasn't materialistic like Marxist thought would be. So maybe in a word we could say that he was trying to bring some of the elements of theology of liberation, the preferential option for the poor, and this very strong need for social engagement, but in a way that was not as divisive as the theology of liberation. I don't know if that's...
You used a word a minute or two ago, murky. There are a lot of people who consider the concept and the project of synodality to be a little murky. How significant did synodality become in the last years of this pontificate?
Well, it was the term became a buzzword, to be a little flippant about it. And one test of how significant, to jump ahead for a moment, and then I'll jump back, is are people going to be using that term in a few months? Because there are phrases as terms that are associated with the pontificate and then go out of fashion.
New evangelization.
New evangelization.
To mind, for example. Yeah.
New evangelization is a term very closely associated with John Paul and with Benedict. Benedict founded even an office at the Vatican for the new evangelization, which Francis merged into the Office for Evangelization in general. But will synodality be? Will people still be invoking synodality? It's a good question. Pope Francis, toward the very end of his life, approved another cycle of synodal activities. It's supposed to culminate in 3 years with a meeting in the Vatican. So he set this up. Perhaps he was thinking maybe to add some insurance that this would continue. So probably we will still be talking about it for a while. Although it's obviously if the next pope takes a different line, he can certainly reshape that to be whatever he wants. I mean,
one of the main tasks that Pope Francis was given by the cardinals who elected him. Well, there were two. One in particular was the reform of the Curia and Vatican finances, including things like transparency. The other was dealing or expanding the progress of the church with dealing with the sex abuse crisis. Let's start with the whole issue of reform of the Curia and especially Vatican finances. At what point are we now that he has passed, and how can we assess his progress?
Well, he did a number of things. He set up several bodies and task forces, and for a while Cardinal Pell of Australia was in charge of the Secretariat for the Economy, which was a new office. And I would say, well, one thing he did was revive a process that had been underway under Benedict and had kind of stalled, which was to reform the Vatican Bank, which had been scandal plagued for a while and had been used for money laundering and other things. And Benedict started to clean that up, and Francis finished that process. And I think by most accounts, the Vatican Bank is clean. Part of its problem now is justifying its existence as a financial institution, but it's not associated with any scandal. So that was successful. Vatican finances are in a bad way now. The Vatican, the Holy See, runs deficits of tens of millions of euro every year. Peter's Pence, the annual collection for the Pope, is basically tapped out. Its endowment is tapped out, and it's basically spent whatever they collect to try to fill up that deficit. That may not be the fault of the management under the last 12 years. We had COVID, and that was a real big blow to Vatican finances because no one was coming to the museums, which are a big source of money, so I think there is more transparency. It's not as much as some people would like. There's a council for the economy, almost half of which is made up of lay people, almost all of them women, by the way, who are professionals from the worlds of finance and politics and so forth. And they are supposed to oversee the finances of the Holy See. So there's some oversight, external oversight. That's good. And the other half are cardinals from various places. And so I would say there's been progress in that. It's not as transparent as some would like, and certainly it's not as wealthy as the Vatican would like.
Right. Well, and of course there's the issue of the clergy sexual abuse crisis. What kind of a grade would you give Pope Francis? Well,
I think it's pretty clear that the high watermark of the struggle against sex abuse was Benedict's pontificate. There's no question about it. He really practiced zero tolerance in the sense of there was a one strike you're out rule, basically. Anybody who was found guilty of having abused a minor was removed from ministry. Not necessarily laicized in some cases, just simply removed from ministry, but Francis backed away from that policy. He did in some cases on appeal remove that restriction from people who had been found guilty. He was less reluctant. He was less zealous. There was a famous incident in 2018 when he finally was. He had been defending a Chilean bishop who had been accused of covering up sex abuse for a long time, and he'd been very, well, you could say stubborn about it. Finally, when he was confronted with evidence, he changed, and he removed some of the Chilean bishops, and he held a big conference at the Vatican, and he installed a process for investigating and disciplining bishops who cover up abuse. But that process, according to the victims' advocates, has not been very transparent. It hasn't been consistently applied. And also, you could tell in his comments over the course of his pontificate, he felt the church was getting unfairly singled out, and he was kind of defensive about it. And he would always, I don't know, but he would very often remind people that most abuse takes place in the home, and the church has done more than any other institution to combat this.
And the broader problems in culture.
Yes, and although he differed from Benedict in a rare, the Pope Emeritus in a rare public statement during his period of retirement, wrote an article blaming a lot of the sex abuse crisis on the sexual revolution and on permissiveness. Francis took a different line. Francis tended to blame it on clericalism, which was one of his most pejorative words in his vocabulary. In other words, the priests, the clergy were too powerful and too arrogant, and so they covered up for each other. Maybe they both had a point.
Well, in the minute that we have left, I just want to ask you one more question, and that is, what is the one image that stays in your mind that you will always carry about Pope Francis?
Well, my best memory of Pope Francis, and it stirs me and it actually moves me every time I see the video or even think about it, was in Tacloban in the eastern Philippines in January of 2015. He went to talk to people who had had suffered through a typhoon the previous year, and there in fact was a tropical storm underway during the mass, which was an outdoor mass, and everybody was wearing these ponchos, and the wind and the rain was battering the altar and everything. And the Pope, he said, I won't try to quote him from memory, but he was speaking in Spanish. And he said, you may come to me and say, I've lost my faith because I lost my family, I lost my home, I lost everything, and so I don't believe. And I won't even blame you for that. But he said, and he pointed to a crucifix and he said, but he doesn't let us down. Jesus doesn't let us down. I think that was for me, his finest moment.
Yeah. Well, Frank, thank you so much. I know all of us are looking forward to your continuing analysis, not just of the Francis pontificate, but of the conclave that's about to get underway.
Well, thank you, Matthew.
Well, thank you so much for joining me here on Register Radio. I'm Matthew Bunson, Executive Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News. Remember, for a lot more news and commentary, please go to ncregister.com at the National Catholic Register. Until next week, we continue to pray for Pope Francis, for the Church, and for the cardinals who are about to choose his successor. Until next week, please take care and God bless.